today, the First Lady, and she's expressed a desire to sing our song. So, here's how we do it. I hope Gary hasn't forgotten the tune. I hope you haven't forgotten the words. I hope I haven't forgotten the words. And I hope you haven't forgotten the words. One, two, three. Take me out to the ball. Me out to the moon. Buy me some.
From WBRN Radio and on the Boston Red Network, the Monday Morning Quarterback on the 8th of July 2018. As a nation motors through these extreme temperatures of 85, 90 on the West Coast, hadn't checked in with Los Angeles yet today, but over the weekend they were soaring around 100, 110 degrees in various parts of Los Angeles and Los Angeles County. Nonetheless, we are at a very interesting situation here. The Supreme Court nominee to replace Anthony Kennedy. Several names have come up by the Trump administration. We have a discussion in the can, but we also found a better discussion from the people at, let's see, where were they? NBC Meet the Press, I believe. Yeah, it was Meet the Press. They had a number of people there. Susan Page, amongst them Mark Murray, Eugene Robinson of the Washington Post, and see if we can get that up, and someone from the Heritage Foundation. But firstly, let's get this out of the way here. The Washington Post has a very interesting editorial. For once, it's good news. Unemployment went up, and this is by their board. For the rate of unemployment went up to 4%. In May, 600,000 people entered the labor market, and 213,000 jobs were created. They use the word non-farm. We don't use that. But they emphasize that this economy, and effectively that is correct, is Barack Obama and Dr. Janet Yellen. And the Fed is continuing the policy, basically speaking, and looking at the Fed rate here of 2%. That's the inflation rate. Even at 2%, the current rate of growth is moderate at best. Now, that is the Fed's attorney. We were talking about inflation. They were actually talking about even at 2.7%. The current rate, but the problem is they've had this problem 2.7 Trump talked about in the campaign of having 3.5 and 4% growth. You can have that for 1 or 2 quarters, but you can't sustain it, not in a modern capitalist industrial economy. Labor force participation rate went up, if I recall, 0.1%, I believe, is where it was stuck. If you check out our Numbers Man program, that is the economic part of WBRN, the Boston Red Network, where we talk about macroeconomics. We have it all there. That was done on Saturday. Nonetheless, the Fed is more or less contented with the current economic perspective, and they're also concerned about the effects of the tariffs, and we talk about those also on the This Week in Economics program. So various ones here. I was looking at Robert Samuels. Why the Economy is Roaring is his particular take. Every year, the Federal Reserve conducts a massive survey of U.S. households to paint a portrait of their economic habits and spirits. The most recent finding for 2017 are worth examining. Naturally, the president claims paternity. There is nothing unusual about that, no doubt about it. We'll just skip over this, but nonetheless, it is not the economic politics that have no effect in practice through their consequences are often unintended and occur after the sponsor has left the White House. No doubt the full verdict on the Trump tax cuts, etc., won't be clear for years. And we talk about that, which the same is true for President Obama. And then he gives the growth figures here. We've talked about it before. For 2017, 2.3, and the year-end unemployment rate at 4.1. So that was 2017. What kept the expansion going seems to have been cheap money. They call that quantitative easing or accommodation. This is often accrual mortgages where foreclosed businesses failed, unemployment surged. The Fed's study is consistent with such an economic narrative called a report on the economic well-being of households in 2017. Studies based on interviews with more than 12,000 respondents in November and February. The major finding is how much the economy has improved since 2013. 3/4 of the adults said they are either comfortable, 33%, and 40% asked to describe where they are managing their finances. The report said the share said they are doing okay. And labor markets are tighter. 52% of workers received a wage increase, up from 46% in 2016. Now this is in 17. Gains were especially large for workers with high school degrees or less. 49% of those workers got a raise, up from 38%, roughly about a 10% increase. Although many indicators of economic well-being were lower for African Americans and Latinos compared with Europeans, they were much higher in 2013. Some of these little items here, won't go very much into it. And of course, problems persist. Half of the 22 to 24-year-olds still live with their parents, and mostly to save money by their late 30s. They share that share has shrunk 11%. About 40% of adults say they are having trouble meeting a $400 emergency expense. What is powering the economy is the economy, I suppose. Its forward momentum is less the product of any sophisticated economic theory or partisan policy. This is according to Samuelson, than of the pragmatic rebuilding of purchasing power and confidence. Well, confidence was down a little bit, not very much. Consumer debt burdens have declined, jobs have increased, incomes have risen. The forward motion is not spectacular, but it's a steady eddy, as they say. We tend to overanalyze the economy, and to be sure, President Obama's handling of the financial crisis and the Depression had the foundation for recovery. But according to Samuelson, neither President Obama or Trump are the prime movers of today's economy. The main engine now is a classic adjustment process in which excesses are reduced or purged and allowing the expansion of goods and services to resume. That is, of course, positive news. The negative news is that the process itself goes to excess and causes the economic apparatus to stumble. The question is the next recession. This is one of the big arguments that has been out for a very, very long time about recessions occurring every few years, 10 years or whatever. This does not happen to happen. This is what happens when an economy runs amok. Period. We had a report here, and we'll put this up. We'll go into it, I should say, in another production. One of the other things we were looking at here, let's see if we can get this. We won't do this one. But we were looking at a book, and I'm not sure where we are here. This is from the Washington Post. Why the middle class can't afford a life anymore in America. Larry Gitling here. This is on the 23rd of June. I wanted to get this in here, at least some of it. It talks about a couple living in San Jose, California. Matt Berry, he drives Uber. His wife, Nicole, teaches as well. He's a history teacher and teaches economics at the public Live Oak High School. But due to astronomical costs in his area, 15,000 square foot starter home costs $680,000. Teachers are killing themselves, Barry says in the book, squeezed why our families can't afford America. That is out, and we were looking at it. I shouldn't be having to drive for Uber at 8 o'clock at night on a weekday. I just shut down from the mental toil and grading of papers between rides. Now, this is a book that's out in her new book. Alicia Quarrell lays out how America's middle class is being wiped out by the cost of living far outpacing their salaries, while a slew of traditional secured professions like teaching can no longer guarantee a stable income to clothe and feed a family. The middle class is now 30% more. Life is more expensive than 20 years ago. Core writes, that's Quart, citing the costs of housing, education, etc. In some cases, the cost of daily living over 20 years has doubled. In one of her book's many striking examples, she cites a Pew study before the crash and depression of 2008. Only 1/4 of Americans viewed themselves as lower class or lower middle class. No longer. After the depression, a full 40% of Americans view themselves at the bottom of the pyramid. One of the main messages of the book, therefore, is that people find it impossible to make ends meet. They shouldn't blame themselves. It is the system indeed. The main problem is a basic lack of 24 21st century, a safety net for families. Quarles tells the Post, this is the New York Post owned by Murdoch. I thought it was unusual that it came up here. But it goes on. We won't get into the daycare part. We have to move along here. But this is the other side. She writes that according to the Department of Education, college and university administrative positions have grown by 60% between 1993 and 2009, 10 times the rate of tenured faculty. By contrast, in 1975, full-time tenured screen professors were 45.1% of American professor rate. As of 2011, they were only 24%. Only one professor in six, 16.7%, actually had a tenure. Less than 20%. Something like 40% of teachers in American college and universities are adjuncts. This is insane, she had said. Middle-class parents are spending all their savings to pay for college, where their children are going to be taught by people making roughly $3,000 a class per semester. It's going to change the quality of education because people are teaching 4 classes a semester for no money. Several adjunct professors, these are people without tenure, normally with master's degrees. They could have less than a master, or they could have PhDs. Justin Thomas taught a total of 4 to 6 classes a semester in 2 colleges. That's in Illinois. The first paid him $3,100 per class. The second less than $1,675. Quarles writes that his paycheck arrived a month after the semester began, and during those 4 weeks it was macaroni and cheese and baked potatoes every night for his 2 daughters. And she goes on to list some other people here. One woman taught for Columbia College in Chicago, a grand total of $4,350 per class per semester, never making more than $24,000 a year. So these are some of what is happening here to the middle class. And there's another organization, the NGO, Leave a Law Behind, an organization that helps lawyers exit the profession. You would imagine that happening. It didn't in our time as badly. But Casey Berman told Quarles that he saw his mission as motivating former lawyers who are either broke or deeply frustrated, or both. In Alaska, 56.7% of those with law degrees are not working as lawyers. In Tennessee, it's 53.6% were working degree holders were working as lawyers. In Missouri, it's 50.8%. In Maryland, 50.3%. There are excess attorneys in all 3 states. But for the record, if you're in Rhode Island, North Dakota, or Delaware, there are attorney space there. According to the Times, 10 months after graduation, only 60% of law school's class of 2014 found full-time jobs, and they were lucky with long-time prospects. So this is some of what is going on. The average law student's debt was about $140,000 in 12, and a 59% increase over 2004. So in other words, the cost of education is more, period. A report published by the Center for Work-Life Law found that so-called family responsibilities discrimination cases have risen from 269% over the last decade. So some of the things happening here, this is a very interesting segue. Let's go back and we'll get in this from Meet the Press.
Welcome back. Panelists here, Pulitzer Prize-winning columnist for The Washington Post, Eugene Robinson. Susan Page, the Washington Bureau Chief of USA Today. Danielle Pletka, the Senior Vice President at the American Enterprise Institute. And NBC News Senior Political Editor, Mark Murray. Of course, my partner every morning on First Read. Welcome all. Let's start with Supreme Court. What we're learning this morning is that the Senate Republicans have a preference, and they would prefer less of a fight. Raymond Kethledge, Thomas Hardiman, Susan Page. Of the final four, those two are who Mitch McConnell prefers, essentially because Brett Kavanaugh is too much of a paper trail, apparently, and Amy Barrett would spark a culture war. That's essentially the message McConnell is sending.
So here's what's amazing. Brett Kavanaugh's biggest problem is that he is associated with the last Republican president, right? With George W. Bush. Who knew that would be such a liability with the next Republican president? And the argument for Amy Barrett is the same argument for and against, that she'd spark a culture war, because there are some Republicans who think that would be great. And the question is, will President Trump think that as well? She's 46 years old. That's an asset. You name her to the court and she gets confirmed. She could be there for 4 decades.
Eugene Robinson, let me put up there's each one of these has a conservative concern about them. Sort of as Susan mentioned with Brett Kavanaugh, it's the Bush connections. One administration official called him the low-energy Jeb Bush pick. Raymond Kethledge, Ann Coulter calls, I think, an open border zealot. Amy Barrett, the culture war, and the question is that good or bad? You could have that discussion. And then the fear on Hardiman is he a Roberts or a Souter? And this one. So it seems like conservatives have a way of killing any of them here.
Right. So what are they looking for? I mean, some sort of, ironclad guarantee that they, in writing, that we will uphold the entire conservative agenda as you see it, by the way, not as other conservatives might see it. I think if conservatives would take a breath and look at these candidates, they see they're all really conservative, as far as we know, as far as we can tell from anything they've written. I mean, there's nothing that I've seen pointed out in any of their writings that indicates they're closet liberals. Now, when judges get to the Supreme Court, guess what? They take their job seriously, and they actually look at the cases, and sometimes they don't decide in a way that their prior ideological leanings would indicate.
Mark Murray, Thomas Hardiman, I think, has an advantage over all of the others with President Trump for one reason.
Yeah.
Thomas Hardiman's relationship with the president's sister. Explain.
Yeah, those relationships do matter, particularly with President Trump. And, the argument for also Thomas Hardiman is that he doesn't have that kind of paper trail. And to me, the biggest question about the Supreme Court pick is who ends up having the most pressure on them? Is it someone like Senator Susan Collins and Republican Senator Lisa Murkowski? Or is it the Joe Manchin, the Democratic of West Virginia, Joe Donnelly of Indiana, and the Hardiman-Kethledge with not a big paper trail, they're more bland jurists. The pressure would probably be on the Manchins and the Donnellys. But all of a sudden, if you are talking about Amy Barrett, who has said some explicit things about abortion and on the constitutionality of the Affordable Care Act, the pressure certainly then goes to Collins and Murkowski.
Danielle, it seems as if the president's got a choice to make. Does he want to win or a fight? That's what McConnell's presenting him, right?
Yeah, I think that's absolutely true. And the president, I suspect, doesn't really care whether it's a win or a fight. He wants somebody who he can sit down and have a beer with. Isn't that what the reporting said yesterday?
Well, that's not Amy Barrett, apparently, because we're told it didn't go well.
I have no understanding of why it might not have gone well or what the president is asking each of these individual nominees, but I think you said the right thing. They're all conservatives. They're all qualified people. The fact that someone has a paper trail, to me, it should not be disqualifying. You want people who are not afraid to make tough decisions, people who are serious about their positions and about the rule of law.
Let's talk about what the Democrats are supposed to do here, Eugene. Look, I guess the question is, what kind of fight do they need to put up in order to make this a voting issue? Because it seems as if it's never been a voting issue for the left the way it is for the right.
Look, I don't know if the Supreme Court is ever going to be a voting issue for the left as it is for the right, unless and until Roe v. Wade is overturned, and then it might be. Roe is really what sparked, I think, the conservative, not obsession because it's real, but the conservative focus on the Supreme Court, and the fact that is a voting issue for so many conservatives. And then it's sort of other issues sort of hang off of that. But I think Roe v. Wade is the central trunk of that tree, and so I don't think it's going to get there. there unless something happens to Roe. I think they do need to fight because the base expects them to fight. I mean, even people who are now, they're going to vote, they're excited, but they want to see a fight.
Yeah, they want somebody to climb up the Statue of Liberty.
Isn't part of the problem here that the Democrats are kind of stuck in the last decade? They want this. They're trying to make this a priori a fight about Roe versus Wade and about abortion. And that's not what this is going to be about at the end of the day. What's interesting to me is that the courts have become so important in the last few years because the Congress has stopped doing anything, because the executive branch has so overreached both under Obama and now Trump. People are going to say, it surprises me that the Democrats don't want to get with the 21st century and recognize the power of the courts.
You know, this is a good thing for Republicans in the short term. This is going to help them with turnout. Either way, they're going to have a big fight. Republicans and conservatives that vote on the court. You might want to watch out what you wish for over the long term. If you are credited with overturning Roe v. Wade or with accepting a lot of new state restrictions on abortion rights.
With 5 men, by the way, doing it.
Yeah.
Especially if it's not Amy Barrett, right?
You could
5
pay
men.
a big cost with women voters, with millennials who are pretty clear on where they stand on this issue. And over the long term, this could be the seeds of real problems for the GOP going down the road.
But this all comes down to winning elections. And if the Republicans have been much better in recent elections than Democrats have been, and you ask, Senator Durbin, what was the biggest mistake that Democrats made with Merrick Garland? Their biggest mistake was getting routed in the 2014 midterm election, which allowed Mitch McConnell to take over the Senate. And actually, Democrats held on to a bare majority. You would have Supreme Court Justice Merrick Garland. And so being able to win in midterm elections and presidential elections, that's what gets you control of the court.
Well, go.
Well said.
You guys, then okay.
That is the battle for the court. Very interesting situation there in terms of what do the Democrats do. Well, the Democrats in this particular case can do very little. We normally would cover the announcement by DJ Trump tomorrow night. We will not do it. If you look at all the so-called candidates have been named thus far out there, they're pretty much all alike. There's very, very little difference between them. As far as Roe v. Wade, well, Roe v. Wade is an old hatch issue, no doubt about it. For people 30, 35 years ago, we now have other methods than the old surgical methods of quote-unquote abortion. But it still rings for part of President Trump's constituency, no doubt about that. But the more important things on the court is the court's position on business. And that is what Roberts has brought in there, that they are more favorable towards business matters than people, anti-environment, Anti-Affordable Care Act. Those are the things that really will come out there. The gutting of the Voting Rights Act, that will be more important. But what can be done about it if he appoints this justice in the vacant slot, which of one of these it is, it doesn't really matter very much. And as far as justice is taking up the work of the court, that used to be the case. We go back to Justice Brennan. Justice Brennan was of the Institute. He was, in fact, a Republican. But now he would be seen as a flaming liberal, and he was when he left the court. But you virtually don't have that anymore. These characters like Roberts came on there very conservative. He still is very conservative. Could Roberts change over time? Well, there's one fact about the Supreme Court. As the nation changes, the court tends to be a little bit more accommodative. There was an article written in the 60s. Let's see, what was it at the time? 9 men in let me see, what was it? 9 men, European men that think black or something to that effect there. They had, of course, black robes on. I think it was on the cover of Time, if I recall. Anyway, didn't look it up. But basically, the court, if you go back to Justice Tenney and various other characters there, Plessy versus Ferguson, very conservative courts, up until the time that Roosevelt started appointing people. And then I Like Ike, he appointed Earl Warren, which he claimed was a mistake. Earl Warren had been the governor of California, the attorney general then, was Supreme Court justice, under which the Brown decision was rendered. And various other decisions. Hugo Black was there. Hugo Black had one time had been in the Klan. He was out of Alabama and became one of the leading liberals on the court. But that was a different time in a different place. It was in the 60s. They moved out in the 70s as Nixon came in and appointed Berger out of Minnesota. But there was also Blackman out of Minnesota, who was a doctor that was one of the leading advocates for women's reproductive rights. He has long since left the court. But basically getting a more conservative, President Obama was able to appoint two justices, with two justices there. And Clinton appointed some, but basically the Gossage came on to Trump, and one more, and possibly, since you have justices in the 80s and in the 70s, Trump could appoint one or two more. Will this make a difference? Yes, it will make a difference in the short term. And when we say short term, we're speaking basically the next 5 years. Because some of these justices can be around for 40 years. Will that be in the future? Well, perhaps so. People live longer these days. But the nation would have changed. One of the things to look at with the court is that basic, quote-unquote, big-ticket items, that is your reproductive rights, your Voting Rights Act, the Affordable Care Act, right now. Tenure, we talked about that. There are cases making their way from California on tenure. And to abolish tenure, basically speaking, it's almost been abolished anyway. So you start looking at this as an accommodative to the economic system that we now have. That was the whole theme of Ms. Quarles' paper, a book actually, and one of those. We'll review the book later here. I'll have to get it and read it, but nonetheless, this is the future. So the court is accommodative to business today. And if you look at various things, voter suppression, that's been the Republicans' stock and trade. The court has went along with it. But overall, where will the American people go? This determines where the court goes more than anything else. As the Congress changes to be more progressive, will that happen in 2018 or 2020? We have to look to see. But as those things change in the next 5 years, we'll see the court dealing with, or grappling, what do you want to call it, with different issues. That's one of the more important things to see, because the big ticket items today, reiterate that, will not be there. And where will the economy go? Well, we'll wait and see. We've had this before. We've had these conservative courts, had them in the 20s. They accommodated the economic time in which they were. But those periods now are very tenuous within themselves. Just looking at where tenure is in high schools and colleges, where the middle class can't make, quote-unquote, ends meet, 3 or 4 jobs, the cost of houses, the cost of rent, those things are some of the issues that the court cannot attack, but at the same time they can deal with basic voting suppression items that we see and we know to be very big factors. Let me move on with the rest of the broadcast here. Oops. Spend a little time on the All-Star game. It's set up here. Won't go through the whole thing, but the American League starting off. Wilson Ramos, he's with the Rays, will be the catcher. This is for the American League. And Salvador Perez of the Royals will be the reserve. And on the first base, Jose Altuve of the White Sox. This is his second appearance. He is 31 years old. And the reserve will be Mitch Moreland of the Red Sox. Wait a minute here. Jose Altuve is with the Astros. Jose Brenu is with the White Sox. Get him right in a minute here. He's 28 years old. The other one is 31 years old. That would be at second base. The reserve will be Mr. Torres of the Yankees. On third base, let's see, Jose Ramez of Cleveland, and the reserve would be Avery Bergman of the Astros. The shortstop will be Matty Machado of the Orioles. Each team has one All-Star, incidentally. And Francisco Lindor of Cleveland will be the reserve. And the outfield, Mookie Betts of the Red Sox. And the reserve will be Mike Trout of the Angels. As for the another this is the outfield. I'm sorry about that. Not the reserve. Mike Trout of the Angels. Mike Trout's only 27 years old. And we have Mr. Aaron Judge of the Yankees also out there. Be his second appearance. He's 26 years old. And now we're down to the reserves. Finally, Michael Bradley of Cleveland. Shinso Chan of the Chu of the Rangers. And Mitch Henniger of the Mariners. And George Springer of the Astros. The designated hitter, the DH, DJ Martinez of the Red Sox. And the reserve, there's Nelson Cruz of the Mariners. The pitchers, Trevor Breyer of Cleveland. And Jose Bernos of the Twins. And AJ Hip of Toronto. Corey Kubler of Cleveland, won't name all of these. And Aroldis Chapman will be a reserve. He's, of course, from the Yankees. Joe Jimenez of the Tigers. And Craig Nimbler of the Red Sox. Kimbler. And for the National League, Freddie Freeman from Atlanta. The reserve would be, these are first base. The reserve would be Goldsmith of the D-backs and Josie Valtu of Cincy. And at second base, Javier Betts of the Cubs. And the reserve there will be Ozzie Abreu of Atlanta and Scooter Gennett of the Reds. That's in Cincinnati. On third base, that will be Nolan Hernandez of the Rockies. And the reserve there will be Eugene Ceres of the Reds. And the shortstop will be Brandon Crawford of the Giants. It's his second appearance. The reserve would be Trevor Story of the Rockies. And in the outfield, Nelson Macias of Atlanta, Bryce Harper of the Nationals, and Matt Kemp of the Dodgers. And, of course, a bunch of reserves here. Lorenzo Cain of the Brewers, and Charlie Blackmon of the Rockies. And the pitchers, this is for the National League, Patrick Coburn, the D-backs, and Jacob DeGrom of the Mets, and John Lester of the Cubs. These are some of the starters. And from the Cardinals, Aaron Nolan, of the Phillies, and Max Scherzer of the Nationals. Some of the reserves: Doolittle, he's from the Nationals. Josh Nader of the Brewers, Brad Hand of the Padres, and Kenley Jansen of the Dodgers, and Felipe Vasquez of the Pirates. And the final vote going on there, we incidentally did vote there. Let's see, who did we vote for there? Maybe we'll just keep it a secret there. Anyway, what did we vote for there? I'm not sure. Oh, Max Muncy of the Dodgers. Anyway, this is the All-Star lineup, game lineup. They're still voting to be done. This is from USA Today. Incidentally, the roster, the Red Sox, Astros, and Giants dominated. And the upstart Atlanta team gets 4 All-Stars in the National League. Interesting at best. And let's see. A good time to take a pause here, and we'll go to ESPN. Well, we'll start with the World Cup. Of course, we have England and Croatia there, who will move out from there. That'll be on a Wednesday. And Belgium and France, that'll be in Leningrad. They've changed the name to St. Petersburg. Who is favored there? Well, perhaps France would come out on top. And then, of course, we would have England and Croatia. Will England be able to surpass? Let's just hear a little bit of this.
Today where they could have controlled the game better and they didn't. I think England can do that against Croatia, and I think there's athleticism from England that can be superior to the back line of Croatia. So in the end, the balance goes to England, and yes, they make it to the final.
England will win, I think, against
Croatia.
Croatia.
You're Mr. Negative.
No, I think England will win. Croatia's wide players, I think, will be taken back. You like that, don't you? Trippier and Bayer, because that's what they did in the previous game, I think, against Denmark. So I think England will win the game. They will control the game.
Who surprised you, Rob? Well, obviously, we haven't spoken to you for a couple of weeks. There's all this.
And water in the garden.
In life in general. Which player have you thought, wow, I didn't quite think that he would bring what he has to the table?
In terms of the England?
Yes.
I think every single player has done better than I thought he would. I would say that Lingard has done much, but he didn't play his best today. But I wouldn't have had him in the team at the start of the tournament. But now he's making those runs from midfield. He's been quite dynamic. Trippier, there's always the talk, was Walker going to play as the wing-back, or was it going to be Trippier? Were they going to bring somebody else in at centre-half? But Trippier, who lacks athleticism when it comes to defending, has done really well. And he's got lots of crosses in, so he's certainly surprised me.
Right back, best right back in the tournament.
Right wing-back.
Right wing-back. Wing-back, of course. Early thoughts, looking ahead to this game?
I think England, I honestly think England will get to the final.
Well, so much for that conversation. Can England outlast Croatia? It'd be interesting there. If England is knocked out, interesting. These are semi-finals here, and then go to have Belgium versus France. Can France, as they say, advance? Well, we'll see here how this goes. Incidentally, the England-Croatia will be in Moscow, so it'll be on the mainline ticket, so to speak. And, of course, France and Belgium and how they will rank out. Don't have the odds on this, but on to Major League Baseball. In 10, the Yankees were in Toronto. They outlasted the Blue Jays 2-1. The Athletics were in Cleveland. Athletics shut out Cleveland 6-0. The Rangers were in the Motor City and shut out the Tigers 3-0. The Rays were in New York and 9 to goose eggs over the Mets. Mets have been playing very well this year. The Marlins and Nationals in D.C. It was all Marlins, 10-2. The Phillies and Pirates 4-1 over their cross-state rival, the Phillies. Atlanta and the Brewers in Milwaukee was all Brewers there. I guess the Brewers didn't drink too much beer this time. 10-3. The Orioles and Twins in Minnesota. It was Twins 10-1. The White Sox and Astros in Houston. Astros 2-1. The Red Sox and Royals in Kansas City. That is a contested game we tuned into. 7-4 Royals. Red Sox get run out of town. The Red Sox over the Royals. And in 10, the Cubbies turned this around, and Reds, they didn't turn it around. Let's see. Cubbies 6-5. Oh, well. And Cardinals and Giants out in San Francisco. Giants 13-8. The Rockies and Mariners 6-4. Mariners over the Rockies. That was in Seattle. And the Padres and D-backs in the desert in 16. The Padres finally pulled that out 4-3. They had 13 hits, no errors. And the Diamondbacks had 14 hits. The Dodgers and Angels in Los Angeles. Angels 4-3. Henney was a winner there, and Anderson got the save. Excuse me. Anyway, that will do it for us on the Monday Morning Quarterback on the 9th of January. Oh, wait a minute. The 8th? Let me make sure what day we're on here. On the 9th of January. January of July 2018. Got the date. Hopefully we started this out on that. And we have another round of talk shows from ABC. Hopefully we'll be able to get some of that in here from ABC. So we got NBC, we had ABC, and also there's some from Face the Nation at CBS. And we try to round these out, and of course we have to edit them down naturally. Anyway, nonetheless, we'll see you next time. Have a good week, everyone.
Here as well. Let's say Mueller does come forward with some kind of report before the final hearings, which are likely to be in October. Isn't that, and we heard the response there from Leonard Leo, but isn't that going to strengthen the Democrats' case for delaying anything if a Mueller report drops right in the middle of confirmation hearings?
It'll just, what it'll do, I think, quite frankly, is make confirmation easier, because then people would be distracted. If the Supreme Court is the only thing that people are going to be able to focus on, that'll be one thing. If we're focusing on a report from Bob Mueller and the Supreme Court, this nominee will, I think, sail sail through because people will be distracted by the brightest, shiniest object. And let me say this, there's not going to be a report. I'm willing to bet you right now there will be no report until after the election. There's no way he's going to finish listen, George, he's going to have to finish them. We're sitting here today at July 7th or 8th, right? July 8th. He's going to have to finish, by September 1st. Not going to happen.
If there's ever an argument to delay a Supreme Court nominee, it is with a special prosecutor issuing a report on whether the President of the United States colluded with Russia, obstructed justice. That is an argument to delay a Supreme Court nominee.
Really, because you're speculating that at some point a matter like that may in fact get to the Supreme Court, and that person you're already deciding could be the deciding vote, when in fact, when you look at what happened when President Clinton was in office, the people who President Clinton appointed voted against him on the Paula Jones matter. Supreme Court justices on issues like that are not going to vote in a partisan way. They're not going to vote according to party. We've seen that over and over again, whether it was the Nixon tapes case, whether it was Bill Clinton and Paula Jones.
Although we have seen the court get more and more partisan over time.
They rose above it.
But Governor, the notion that somehow senators are going to be distracted from the Supreme Court decision, I think is that's a stretch. This is one of the most.
What the reports
This is one of the most remarkable shifts that we're going to have in the Supreme Court in generations. The 1930 shift was remarkable. The 1968 shift was profound. This one is as consequential, and there's no way that Democratic senators or Republican senators will be distracted from it. And this is going to be litigated.
Particularly when it is the last branch of government that performs a check and balance on this president.
Let's not forget that this nominee is going to get confirmed because of Harry Reid getting rid of, including the nuclear option for court picks, and so Democrats have no one but themselves to thank.
Well, it was actually Mitch McConnell who did away with the filibuster.
Both sides are always switch places on all of these nominations. Isn't it true that even if Harry Reid had not done away with the filibuster, if it were necessary to do away with the filibuster now to get a Supreme Court pick through, Republicans would do it, just as the Democrats would.
I don't know if Chuck Grassley would were Republicans. But the reality is this is the way we select Supreme Court justices now in this country, and whoever this person is, they will be able to get confirmed.
And I'm not ready to buy into this, that this is the most profound moment in the court since 1968. Anthony Kennedy, if you look at his voting record, in the main, if you don't look at Roe and at gay rights, Anthony Kennedy
too historic. Two of the most important decisions ever made, Governor.
But guess what? On most other things, I understand your point, except that those issues are much more important to some as opposed to others. There are other issues on the court that are much more important to certain people around the country. And Anthony Kennedy has been a mainline.
You're right that Roe versus Wade is important to the majority of the country.
It has been a mainline conservative. And so this profound change that we're talking about, I think, as someone who's appointed Supreme Court justices at the state level, no matter what you're told before you nominate them, take my word for it, they forget once they get to the court and they make decisions based upon what they believe is right.
Right, but you have a president. Let's not forget that this is the first president who laid out some pretty strict litmus tests during the campaign, which is what ultimately helped him get elected, on the kind of justice that he's looking for, both on Roe v. Wade, also on health care and many other things.
Are you trying to tell me that Bill Clinton and Barack Obama did not have a litmus test on Roe v. Wade? You trying to tell me that Bill Clinton or Barack Obama would have appointed a justice that they knew was going to not support Roe versus Wade? Well, please stop. Just because Donald Trump was honest and said it. Wait a second. Just because Donald Trump was honest and said it, and Bill Clinton and Barack Obama didn't, don't tell me that they would have considered pro-life justice.
All you have to do is look at the court today to know that the governor's right about that. And look, all this conversation about Roe v. Wade, that's not likely to ever come up. That is not likely to be the legal precedent. I mean, the court has moved to Casey versus Planned Parenthood as the legal precedent that
maybe not a strict overturn, but you can see the court continuing to improve, shaving away at Roe v. Wade.
Also the science on abortion is the whole other factor that we forget 36 years later.
No question.
Has moved this debate. This debate is completely different than it was when Roe v. Wade passed, and any future court cases are going to be different because of all of those factors.
I think that's absolutely right. Let's turn quickly back to the investigations. And Chris, let me go back to the Michael Cohen potential cooperation with prosecutors. You heard Rudy Giuliani saying he's not worried about it at all. Do you share that?
Listen, I don't think Rudy's telling the whole truth there. I mean, I don't think you can never not be worried when someone who has at one time represented your client is now in the crosshairs of prosecutors. But what I will tell you is I do think that Michael Cohen's role, based upon my observations, has been significantly overplayed. He was one of many lawyers that Donald Trump had. And the fact that
he got the hottest of hot-button issues, didn't he? Trump Tower in Moscow, the Stormy Daniels case.
Listen, you know what? My experience with Donald Trump is there are very many cool legal issues that he gets involved in, not ones that don't create a lot of controversy and a lot of heat. So, listen, but it's all speculative, George. In the end, if Michael Cohen has some things to say, I think he's made it very clear he's going to say them with the actions he's taken by hiring a new lawyer, by cleaning up his Twitter handle, all the rest of it. And by the way, that in my experience as a prosecutor, every criminal defendant makes almost all the time, which is to put their own liberty and the sake of their family ahead of anybody else. That's what happens.
I thought that Michael Cohen's interview with you was absolutely astounding, and it's clear that somebody who has had a long time loyalty to this president has shifted. That has to be causing anxiety inside of the White House and with the president's counsel.
That has got to be the last word today.
Sowing discontent and even false information to try to divide our allies and take them away from the West and toward some dissidents, and then hopefully they think influenced by them. They're also doing things like the terrible attack, the nerve agent attack in Great Britain. They're supporting a Syrian dictator who is using chemical weapons on his own people to kill even children. And it's just on and on and on. They are also in violation of the very important INF treaty with the United States. They are not supposed to be building ballistic missiles at an intermediate range, but they are, and we know they are. So there are so many areas where they are working against the interests of freedom and democracies and peace in the world, and it is a big part of our deterrence effort to keep them from taking over sovereign nations, as they did in the Ukraine when they took Crimea in 2014.
Well, on that point, President Trump has seemed to leave the door open to recognizing Russia's annexation of Crimea in some public statements. Last week on this program, Ambassador John Bolton said, while that's not U.S. policy, he said the president is open to changing that. Can you reassure our allies that the president won't agree to recognize Crimea as part of Russia when he meets privately with Vladimir Putin?
Well, I think that our alliance is very solid, and including all of the efforts that the United States is making to shore up the sovereignty of the Ukraine. The Ukraine people, they stood very tall in their really peaceful revolution is what it was at Maidan. They have stood strong for their sovereignty and their right of self-governance, and we are standing behind them on that. And there's no light between any of our allies on that very important issue.
And the president, it sounds like you're saying, won't change his position on that. But the president seems to be muddying the waters on this question of whether Vladimir Putin is a friend or a foe. I mean, just this week, he called Vladimir Putin a fine man. Is that how you would describe Putin?
Well, I wouldn't, but I will say that despite how the many malign activities that Vladimir Putin has been doing just in the last few years, NATO talks to Russia. We have what's called a NATO-Russia Council, where the ambassador from Russia meets with our NATO ambassadors. Many of the foreign leaders in our alliance meet with Putin. Most certainly, the Europeans do. But the effort, and our military does too, as well. We have military-to-military talks with the Russian chief of defense. But this is to deconflict. It is as not to allow escalation of hostilities. And also, I think the president will encourage Vladimir Putin to start changing their behavior to be, we'd like for Russia to be an ally, a trading partner. But right now we have sanctions against Russia because of their malign influence and the things they're doing that are very disruptive, trying to divide our alliance. So yes, we should be talking to Vladimir Putin, and many of our allied nations do as well. But it is to try to bring them in the tent instead of just constantly seeing
political analysis. Rehan Salam is the executive editor of National Review and a policy fellow at the National Review Institute. Kelsey Snell is a congressional reporter for NPR. Mark Landler and Tolu Olorunipa cover the White House for the New York Times and Bloomberg News, respectively. Let's start off with you, Mark. This NATO summit, we heard from Ambassador Hutchinson, this strong alliance standing up to Russia. But the concern is what happens in the days afterward. Why are our allies so concerned about the summit?
Well, I think, as Senator Coons said on the air earlier, a lot of people fear a repeat of the president's trip to the G7 in Quebec, followed by his summit with Kim Jong-un. He was extremely antagonistic, if not outright hostile, to our G7 allies, and then had this love fest with Kim. And I think the fear is, given some of the things the president has said in the last few days about NATO, he said the other day in Montana that they're killing us, that he'll go and have yet another rocky, antagonistic meeting in Brussels, and then go on to Helsinki and meet with Vladimir Putin and have a very kind of harmonious meeting. And that is a pattern that at the very least runs counter to 6 decades of American foreign policy, but it's extremely damaging, and it comes against a backdrop of increasing trade battles with Europe, questions about obviously the amount of spending that they're on their defense, and so there's just a lot of fear that we've gotten locked into what they view, our allies view, as a very dangerous and damaging pattern.
And Tolu, I mean, you don't hear praise from Democrats very often of the president, but Senator Coons said there is a good news story here when it comes to NATO, that spending is up. So why is the president not focusing on the win? Why is he focusing on what he says is a problem?
Yeah, we see this pattern from the president regularly. He wants to push our allies as hard as possible to move in a direction that, even if they're already moving in that direction, he wants them to go even further. He won't sort of accept a win. A lot of the spending increases that happened started under President Obama, and it's increased under President Trump. And President Trump has taken credit for that. He said that Jens Stoltenberg, the NATO Secretary General, is his biggest fan because spending is up in NATO, but he wants them to do more. And he conflates the issue of trade and the issue of security assurances. He wants NATO countries not only to help the U.S. By spending more on their own defense, but also to remove some of the trade barriers and to remove the trade deficit that currently exists. So you hear the president talk about those things as one and the same, the trade deficit between the U.S. and the EU and the NATO spending issue. The president believes that the U.S. is getting taken advantage of, and that the U.S. needs to push much more harder on its allies, even more so than its adversaries.
Rehan, the other thing that we will start this week with, which is big news in and of itself, is this announcement of the president's Supreme Court pick. Monday night, 9 p.m., primetime presentation here. Of the 3 contenders, who is most pleasing to conservatives here? Who do you think is actually going to become the nominee?
Well, conservatives are divided on the question, partly because different groups have different objectives. If your objective is to have a justice who, like William Brennan, plays the role of strategist and chief diplomat for a new majority on the court, then someone like Brett Kavanaugh has very, very strong credentials. If you want someone who is likeliest to get confirmed, then you perhaps want Kethledge. If you want someone who is going to make a mark culturally and politically, if you want someone who will provoke a constructive fight within the Senate, then perhaps you want Amy Coney Barrett. So it really depends. Fight? Well, what that means is if politically speaking, you don't necessarily want this to go easily, right? If you have domestic political considerations at work, if you want to draw out contrasts in our, larger political conversation, then it's possible that a more polarizing nominee is actually a better fight for the Trump administration. So again, it really depends on what your objective is, because if you have, one nominee who goes down, that could also create a larger conversation, and also that could be very difficult for some of the Senate Democrats running for re-election in 2018.
And Kelsey, you're ending exactly where I want to pick up with you, which is that there's the politics of just getting confirmation, but there's also the politics of how this plays nationally.
Absolutely.
The proximity of seating a justice in October to those November races. What's the connection?
The connection is extremely strong, because particularly for those red state Democrats, people like Heidi Heitkamp in North Dakota, Joe Donnelly in Indiana, they're in a really awkward position where they have to decide, do they vote in a way that many of their voters, more conservative voters, would be happy and have them help approve one of these justices, or do they want to be in a situation where they're bolstering Democrats going into 2020? It is a really, really awkward scenario for them. It's also fairly awkward for people like Susan Collins, who is, again, in a position where she could be a deciding vote here. And it's not something she's uncomfortable with, and it's something she kind of relishes, that moment of being the decider, somebody who gets that moment of being important. But it is still really awkward for Republicans and for Democrats who kind of float in that middle, that very narrow middle that doesn't really exist very much anymore.
And Mark, it seems like from both liberals and conservatives, they want to make this a relitigation of Roe versus Wade. Is it really that simple?
Well, some legal scholars will tell you that they think the odds of Roe versus Wade being relitigated by this court are relatively low, that isn't necessarily the kind of fight that John Roberts, for example, is looking to take on. I have to say that may be the case. There may be a desire on both sides of the spectrum, but by all accounts, Amy Coney Barrett, the person who's most likely to be the catalyst for that, appears to be fading in the kind of sweepstakes. And the other justices, the ones who appear to be, or the other judges, the ones who appear to be the finalists, are less likely to automatically lead to that kind of outcome than Barrett would have been.
And Tolu, it was interesting to hear our Paula Reed reported that in a conversation with Rudy Giuliani, the president's lawyer, he said to her that any Supreme Court justice should not recuse him or herself from any questions regarding the Mueller investigation should it reach that court. Democrats are talking about this. Is this really something that needs to be part of the calculus?
Yeah, you can expect this to come up during the confirmation hearings. There are some of these potential nominees who have written on this topic, specifically on sort of whether a president would have to submit himself to an investigation or lawsuits, criminal or otherwise. And it's clear that this is something Democrats want to put on national TV during these hearings so that the American people will continue to hear about the Mueller probe, will continue to hear about this whole idea of conflicts of interest in the Trump administration and among his appointees. And if the president chooses someone who has written anything that Democrats can seize upon, you can expect them to focus on that very significantly during these hearings and make them try to make some commitments, as you saw during the hearings for various cabinet secretaries early in the administration. Are you going to recuse yourself? Are you going to weigh in on issues where the president may be under investigation? And it's going to be clear that they're going to try to get those commitments early on. You could probably expect to hear this nominee sort of dance around the issue as they often do, without necessarily committing one way or the other, trying to satisfy Democrats while also not necessarily making any specific commitments.
This is particularly a case for Kavanaugh because of his being on the team, the Ken Starr team, and what he wrote in the Starr report about grounds for impeaching Bill Clinton. He laid out a fairly broad set of grounds that you could use to impeach a president. And I think one of the perhaps problematic parts of the Kavanaugh candidacy is that were he chosen, the Democrats would be able to go back to the Starr report and ask him fairly pointedly, these grounds that you've set out, how do they apply potentially to the president who nominated you? That's something that's on the minds of a few people in Trump's circle.
It's fascinating to see all the dimensions to this here. Kelsey, I want to bring up to you, I asked Senator Ernst about the president's comments at his rally this week about Senator Elizabeth Warren, in which he seemed to be dismissive of the Me Too movement. if you put that in the context of other things over the course of the week, in particular, his hiring of Bill Shine to the communications shop. This is a former Fox News executive who was pushed out of that company because of allegations that he helped to silence women who'd been abused by the former CEO, Roger Ailes. Is that an unfair dot to connect here? Are people being overly sort of judgmental, or is this a pattern of behavior that suggests the president doesn't take this seriously?
I think that it's not unfair to suggest that there is some pattern here, and I've talked to many Republicans included who feel that way. There is some concern, though, that Republicans don't all agree with the Me Too movement. I was just out reporting in several different states, including Washington State, where I talked to a lot of Republican women who feel like the Me Too movement is an arm of the left. Essentially, it's the kind of feminism that they don't connect with, and they don't connect with the idea of Me Too. And it may be that the president sees that in his base and doesn't feel that he has to be a part of what many people feel is not just a movement in American politics, but is a greater cultural movement across the world. So there is some tension happening here, and I think that it makes it very uncomfortable for particularly Republican women like Joni Ernst, who want to stand on the side of women and not necessarily have to be defending the president again on this.
Ryan, explain that, because this isn't necessarily a feminist platform aligned with certain positions. This was a movement about defending victims of abuse. What is the perception in conservative circles?
Well, again, the conservative world is very diverse and multifaceted, so I can't give you a single answer to that.
We're learning that more and more these days.
Oh, sure. I mean, it's much more of a coalition than a unified movement.
But for the president to feel, as Kelsey was just laying out, that his base finds this something they agree with.
Well, I'll say this. If you're looking at the gender gap in our politics right now, it is very pronounced. It is very extreme. This isn't just a development in the United States. This is true in all of the market democracies increasingly. Donald Trump does not fare well with women voters. It was very crucial that he win over married suburban women in 2016, and that's a group where he is absolutely vulnerable. But it's also the case that even if you're looking at younger voters, he is doing respectably with men. So you don't really know what kind of counter movement you might see. And also, Democrats are very successful in recruiting female candidates in this cycle. But that also goes along with the fact that many of these female candidates are very ideologically progressive in very pointed ways, and that's something that might also elicit a backlash down the line. So we can't really predict exactly how this is going to turn out.
I need to point out here that the president did pull the plug on his EPA administrator this week, Scott Pruitt, someone who withstood a lot of negative headlines. Does he have a political future, and do you see his deputy stepping in as any kind of wholesale change?
I imagine that the underlying policies will be consistent at the EPA. But as for Pruitt's political future, he is someone who is deeply political, deeply ambitious, has been for a very long time, had been lobbying. He endorsed Jeb Bush earlier on, and there are reports that he was very solicitous of having senior roles in the federal government. So I think that he is certainly going to try to make a political comeback in the future. Whether or not that effort succeeds is an open question.
And there are several investigations that are still going to run after
That's
he's gone.
A good point to leave it on, that those investigations continue. We'll be back in a moment with CBS News Justice and Homeland Security correspondent Jeff Pegues. He's got a new book out on Russian efforts to tamper with U.S. elections.